In this module, we'll continue discussing the cognitive development of children that are in elementary school age. According to Piaget, children during the ages of 7 to 11 approximately are in concrete operational stage. This is where their thought is more flexible, but it's also a little bit more logical as long as it's something that's within their capacity to comprehend. We find that children at this particular stage are able to focus on several aspects of a problem and relating to them. And this is something that's called decentration. This is something that is essential for individuals who work on education and developing curriculum, as the understanding of such concept helps us develop material that is adequate to challenge their brain, their thought process. Reversibility is another important component that is helpful during this stage and also later. And this, as you may remember from when we first discussed Piaget, is it's a child's capacity to be able to reverse something. And this is essential for controlling our emotions. We find that in the example I provided, if a child is making figures with Play-Doh, and then another child that's not so nice comes and smashes that figure, it could be emotionally disturbing to see someone behaving that way. But if we know that we could reverse this in a series of steps and build it back up, then it allows us to soothe that sadness or anger that we may be feeling. So this is basically the capacity to think through a series of steps and then mentally reverse the direction. When I was in high school, one of the students there committed suicide because his girlfriend left him. And this would be an extreme example of someone not learning of reversibility. Sometimes songs teach us that we can't live without the other person, and that is just simply not grasping this concept. When we think of the fact that, yes, it's painful when we lose a loved one, but that we'll be able to get back on track, that is a sign of cognitive maturation. Classification is also an important component during this age, and this is when we are able to focus on the relationships that exist between various categories. So children often find it pleasing to collect and to organize things, maybe stamps or baseball cards or even buttons or coins or anything, and then they may shape them into they may make a pattern of buttons maybe with 3 holes or with 4 holes or 2 holes, and we find that this is basically strengthening and stimulating the cognitive process that they're going through. It's important to note that though children are focusing and thinking in logical ways, this is only when they're dealing with concrete information, things that they can perceive directly and that make sense to them. So if it's beyond their capacity, they will not think in logical ways yet. We find also that poor mental operations with abstract ideas are also common here. They do not necessarily make part of their imagination or their world, and as a result of that, they may not do well with abstract thoughts. So clarity is essential for them to be able to obey things, orders and rules. We also find that children master the concept of operational thinking step by step, and that is based on the experiences they have with their parents and with their peers and caregivers. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD, is something that affects about 5% of U.S. children, and this is one that has been controversial and for different reasons. This is considered to be one that is overdiagnosed and also misdiagnosed. And the reason why is because the symptoms, which are inattention, impulsivity, and excessive motor activity, is often seen as a result of maybe the food that they took. This is often noticed by teachers who expect a child to read silently for 20 minutes right after the child had orange juice and cereal which is nothing but sugar, and it makes it difficult for the child to stay put. Now, in some cases, yes, there is an ADHD, and that needs to be treated, but this series of things, environmental conditions, nutrition, and expectations can also lead to a misdiagnosis of this. Boys are often diagnosed more than girls, and we find that because of their inability to pay attention and stay engaged, their IQ score is lower than for those who do not have ADHD. As far as the causes of ADHD, it is believed that ADHD is highly heritable. We do find that children who come from parents who suffer from this or anxiety are likely to suffer from this in here. And we find that this is basically a reduction of blood flow and neural activity at the prefrontal cortex. You may remember that the prefrontal cortex is responsible for attention and inhibition of behavior and decision making and language and thought process. And so when you are unable to inhibit behaviors, then you are acting out every single thought that's presented. There's no filter. We also see that the brain tends to grow more slowly, and this has actually been compared to children without ADHD, and we see that those with ADHD have about 3% smaller in overall volume, and specifically we're looking at the cerebral cortex. The treatment for ADHD the most common is a stimulant medication. We find that at the prefrontal cortex, when there is no activity, they are acting out every thought, every urge. By stimulating and activating this, we could increase the activity in here and then be able to get the responses we want from them. So often the results of them being under medication is an improved attention and an ability to inhibit off-task behavior. However, some people are not too fond of this treatment, as it is something that does change a child from being a hyper and happy child to sometimes very dull attitudes and moods. So the most effective that we see is combining medication and behavior modification techniques. In addition to having greater cognitive maturity, we also make use of memory strategies that allow us to retain and recall information when necessary. This is facilitated by our ability to pay attention for extended periods of time, which is handy during school years. Prior to that, it was helpful, but not necessarily essential for academic performance. The most basic way of passing information on to long-term memory is through rehearsal, and that's basically repeating information over and over again. But if you do not attach any type of story or organization to it, it is likely that that information would not be stored. In order to increase our ability to memorize, we rely heavily on organization tasks or skills, which has something to do with grouping items together, giving a story together, or just finding similarities in there. And this is something that is seen more so as our ability to imagine and to process things based on our schemas and prototypes come into place. Now, for example, mnemonics is used often as an organization's skill or task. For example, PEMDAS, which you may have learned when you were in 5th grade or 6th grade, is something you may still remember, and it's the order of operations in mathematical problems. And that would be easier remembered than having to spell out every single word, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. Phase is another example of organizing things into something that's meaningful for us, and that would be basically the notes in a music staff. So if you were to have, for those of you that are musicians, I believe it's this way here, and you would have, there's one more up here, and in between the lines you would actually see the notes F-A-C-E, and then of course you'd be able to figure out the rest by just looking at it. For a long time it was believed that our intelligence stemmed from our head, the size of our head and of our brain specifically. We now know that that is not true. In fact, Albert Einstein's brain was not bigger than the average brain, and nonetheless, he was able to bring about significant revolutionary thinking and shifts and the way we understood the world and theories of relativity and gravity. Contemporary IQ tests, as we associate intelligence with Einstein, are done to help identify students that may be in need of some special attention, either because they need one-on-one instruction or maybe they are gifted. They've also been used to diagnose cognitive difficulties when there's a suspicion of that. And more recently, they've been used to also help individuals make educational and vocational choices. The first intelligence test that we know of was actually done in France in the early 1900s by an individual by the last name of Binet and another individual by the last name of Simon. Stanford Binet came to be a test that was a revision of Binet and Simon, and this came about in an attempt for that France had to identify those students who were bright for military purposes. So they created a test that was based on the answers that bright individuals and dull students would be able to provide. And depending on their score, they would receive what is known as a mental age score. Now, a mental age score is nothing more than, for example, having an 8-year-old coming in, taking an exam, and the average score that an 8-year-old would provide was 45 items, then that became the norm. So anybody who would answer 45 items correctly would be giving a mental age score of 8. If a 9-year-old showed up and also answered 45 items correctly, they would still be given a mental age score of 8. If a 5-year-old answered 45 items correctly, they would also receive a mental age score of 8. Therefore, again, this would allow them to identify those who were performing at average, below, or above average. This seemed to be working well until they noticed, and this by they I mean a professor in the Stanford University, hence the name Stanford Binet, that this did not allow us to compare among people of different chronological ages. For example, is a 20-year-old scoring at a mental age of 18 the same as a 5-year-old scoring at a 3-year-old level? Well, these are just 2 years apart. From 18 to 20 is 2, from 3 to 5 is 2 years. Nonetheless, there is a big difference between these two. To get around this issue, professor from Stanford University proposed that a formula be revised and created to really comprehend and be able to compare individuals of different ages. And there's where the intelligence quotient comes in. The intelligence quotient is basically the mental age divided by the chronological age times 100. This is a little bit offset, so this CA should be right underneath it. It's a mathematical formula. And what we mean by chronological age is your actual age, whatever your driver's license says. However, the mental age would be your capacity. And what we see when we plug in numbers of the example that was provided in the previous slide is that if a 20-year-old, performs at a mental age of 18, then they get an IQ score of 90. That's not too far off, as you'll see in a bit. But if a 5-year-old performs at a mental age of 3, then they get an IQ score of 60. And that seems problematic. And here's where IQ formula comes from. You can see here that the individual performing and having a score of 90 would be somewhere around here. And having a score of 90 basically means you fall within 68% of the population who take an IQ test. However, the 5-year-old performing at the 3-year-old mental age would mean that the person is performing around here. And that would be significantly lower or below average. It would actually mean that only Fewer than 2% of the population would score that low. As you can see, the distribution is normally distributed here. All test takers who have taken the IQ test seem to perform within one standard deviation from the average. The average is 100, and every line that we go over is a standard deviation. To the right we have a total of 4 standard deviations, and to the left the same. The majority of the test takers, which is 68% of the test takers, again, score within one standard deviation from the mean. And then as we start getting higher to over 115, we see that fewer people score there. Over 130, very few people score there. Over 145, very few. And the same on the opposite end. One of the most common ways that we assess intelligence is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. And this is a test that's appropriate for ages 6 through 16 years old. They're currently using the 4th edition. And this test or scale consists of 2 major parts that have separate scores for each of the parts. So we have a verbal scale in which they test for vocabulary, comprehension of various concepts, reading, and other components that have to do with that. And then there's the performance, or also known as nonverbal, in which they are asked to assemble objects, to arrange pictures in a logical order based on a story or whatever is presented in front of them. The separation of the scores allows us to get an insight as to a person's specific abilities, as we now understand that intelligence is not limited to just verbal or vocabulary. The intelligence is a collective approach with multiple elements, and this test allows us to test those different layers. This assessment requires one-on-one administration, so it is something that consumes time, as you have to sit with every child. For intelligence tests that may be administered to larger groups, there are other assessment types. Our understanding of the distribution of intelligence has also been aligned with our attempt to understand what intellectual disabilities are. And a mental retardation, as they're also known, is basically a disability that may have limitations on intellectual functioning, social skills, adaptive skills, and also our ability to understand concepts. It is estimated that over 7 million people in the United States have some form of intellectual disability. Now, it is important to note that the majority of these 7 million fall and have a mild form of mental retardation. And someone who has a mild form of mental retardation is actually someone who scores with an IQ of 55 to 69. As you may remember, that example of that 5-year-old performing at a 3-year-old mental age would actually fall in the category of a mild mental retardation. Now, the majority of these people have minor deficits. In fact, some of them may not be noticeable to untrained people. They are likely to live seemingly normal lives, and I say normal, quote unquote, as you may have heard the expression of the only thing that's normal in this world is a cycle in the washer. But what we mean is by normal is in accordance to the norm in comparison to other age mates. So these individuals function independently. They're able to hold jobs, have families of their own, and for the most part, they may only stumble on with some tasks, not across the board. Here we see more severe forms of mental retardation. Those who have a moderate mental retardation would score between 40 and 54. And these individuals, the deficits are more obvious and they're seen earlier in life for them. The language may not be at the average age. It may be significantly delayed. Their motor skills may also not be as sharp or as sophisticated. These individuals can also hold simple jobs, but the need for some supervision is always present in their lives. Severe are those who score between 25 and 39, and profound are those who score below 25. And these individuals are generally unable to function independently. They often typically require care for their entire lives, and the care consists of being fed, diaper change, communication of different forms. And before technology, individuals who had profound or severe, because of also maybe paralysis and inability to communicate, we would think that they had no capacity to process any type of mental images. But now with technology, we are able to have them communicate in written form. For example, Stephen Hawking, who is an example of this through a voice box, is able to communicate his thoughts, which seem to be far superior than the average human. The variations in intellectual ability come from various sources. It could be because of biological reasons, meaning hereditary, or just complications and chromosomal things, but there's also environmental, such as fetal alcohol syndrome, which is when the mothers drink alcohol while pregnant. Fetal alcohol syndrome is the most common cause of mental retardation in newborns, and sadly, it is the one that is preventable. Down syndrome is the one where there's an extra chromosome in the 21st pair, and that brings about significant complications. There could also be birth complications where the umbilical cord may be wrapped around the neck of the newborn, and with a significant loss of oxygen, neurons die, and as a result of that, they could suffer from cerebral palsy or other variations of brain damage. And also a hereditary component. We find that while there is a higher likelihood of a child having an intellectual disability if there's a history in the family, there isn't necessarily a clear defect that would be seen or a gene that would be spotted for this in here. For the most part, we would just see that there would be incompetence in some tasks. Prior to the 1970s, there was no guarantee of education for individuals with an intellectual disability. In fact, if you've watched the movie Forrest Gump, you may remember that Forrest's mother, this is a spoiler alert, had to do some favors to the principal so that he could allow Forrest to be part of the school, because by law they didn't have to at the time. So in 1975 they passed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, and this was the beginning of making progress so that children with intellectual disabilities could receive an education as well. Since then, there have been a series of things, and now we find that they're entitled to full education, and they must be given a good environment, a good classroom. Initially, when they passed the law, they did, but they would have them in cold bungalows without heaters or ACs, and very restrictive conditions. Now that is against the law. Mainstreaming, which is a relatively newer component of that, means that these individuals are also part of regular classrooms and with classes with kids that may not have intellectual disabilities. And this is something that ensures that there is progress made by both those who have intellectual disabilities and those who do not, as there is sensitivity and empathy and understanding with one another. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the intellectually gifted. These are students or people who have an IQ score greater than 130. And this may be the train of thought that seems to be the most normal. If you are that gifted intellectually, then you must succeed academically with ease and have doctorate degrees and maybe attorneys and engineers. But we find that gifted people are not necessarily guaranteed to have academic success. While it may facilitate the comprehension of certain things, we find that sometimes when they understand things so easily, they can also run a high risk of dropping out of school because they get bored easily. And so if a child already knows this stuff, and they are going to school with a group of kids that are learning something that is challenging, the child who has already mastered it may be bored and drop out. And so there are programs for the gifted, like magnet programs in LAUSD, that provide an environment that is richer and that is better for them to really challenge their thinking and allow them to do well. When it comes down to understanding intelligence as groups, we find that the background and experiences has a lot to do with our test scores and IQ. Sadly, we find that blacks tend to average 10 to 15 points lower than whites when it comes to the IQ. You have Hispanics who also have between 8 and 12 points lower than whites. We have Asians who are higher than whites. And these groups have been studied significantly because they wonder what the reasons are. Well, what the hypothesis is that the difference in IQ performance is due to familiarity with the information that's being tested. Though it's been decades ago that African Americans and Hispanics and lower socioeconomic status people were not allowed to go to school, we see that there could continue, there could be remnants of this historical dark moments of our history that could still be having an impact on us, restricting individuals from, or limiting them and excluding them from educational settings can really have an effect on our performance. We find that there are standardized IQ tests in the past that also discriminated against certain groups because their experiences would have been different than those of the white majority who were the ones that were writing these tests. So in an intelligence test in the 1970s to second graders, there was this question here that said, what would you do if another child grabbed your hat and ran off with it? And there were two answers: tell an adult, which would be the correct answer, or chase a person and fight to get it back, which would be the incorrect. Remember, this is an IQ test for second graders, and basically those who chose tell an adult were smarter than those who did not. However, it was important and interesting to see that those who chose the correct answer were most white middle-class children. Those who chose the incorrect answer were those who were urban black children and Puerto Rican children who basically grew up in a different environment. And if I may just take you down the line, for those of you that may be familiar with the phrase snitches get stitches, when living in an environment that is known as the hood or el barrio, which is where lower socioeconomic status people may live, we see that snitching or telling an adult is not an option. There is no respect for an individual for that, so you have to fetch for yourself. And in this test in here, they wanted to, or they thought it'd be a good idea to make the telling an adult a correct answer, which would be an indication of a higher IQ score. And we now know that that is not necessarily the case across the board. There's also stereotype threat, which is the fear of being judged on the basis of a negative stereotype. And this often triggers anxiety, which can impact our performance, academic and otherwise. Here you see a graph that shows the effect of stereotype threat on performance and academic performance. We find that African American and Hispanic American children, when told that this was not a test, which is the red mark here, the children scored at about 87% or so. When they were told it was a test, their performance dropped to about 60%. How is it that just the simple words of this is not a test or this is a test of how good at school problems you are has such a drastic impact on their performance? In comparison, we see the Caucasian American children who, when told that it was not a test, they scored kind of similar to the African American and Hispanic American. But when they were told this is a test of how good at school problems you are, they scored better. And this, again, has been used and utilized to understand the stereotype threat on performance. Imagine walking into an interview where you know that individuals will not like you. Imagine walking into an interview where you'll know that they will not cheer for you. Automatically, you may not perform your best. Or maybe you will. And the argument here is that the stereotype threat seems to have an impact a lot more so on certain ethnic groups than in others. As you can see, having an IQ test that is fair has not been easy. There are a lot of factors behind it: environmental, genetic, historical, social, legislative. But nonetheless, there's been the attempt. The culture fair IQ test would be one who would not discriminate against any members or any minority group, but these would be difficult to produce because, again, we cannot control for every single respondent answer in their cultures. If we look at the Western cultures, when we measure intelligence, we ask kids to group things by what they are. So if they were to be a dog and a fish, and a helicopter and a car, they would maybe get the dog and the fish as animals and helicopter and car together in another group. People in Africa and other Eastern cultures, they view and they measure intelligence by grouping things by what they do, not by what they are. And so a dog and a fish would not be in the same category because a dog barks and a fish doesn't. So they could probably split them up, and it doesn't make anyone more or less intelligent. Nonetheless, that's how we assess them. To make things better, we've tried to investigate what allows children to learn with greater ease and be able to perform better academically. And we find that small class sizes are at the top of the list. We find that there are higher scores in reading and mathematics, and this has been replicated time and time again, sadly, when we compare small class sizes or we compare class sizes of lower socioeconomic status. We have an average of about 40 students in each classroom, whereas if you go to a higher socioeconomic status, you have an average class of 18. So this is something that may be at the root of why we have lower graduation rates and lower socioeconomic status. Caring, helpful, and stimulating teachers are also preferred by students. No student has ever expected or demanded that their teacher know curriculum best. No student has ever demanded that the teacher have 3 master's degrees and a PhD. The majority, all students in all levels, they prefer a teacher who respects, a teacher who is helpful and caring. Ethnic and socioeconomic segregation in the United States limits minorities and lower socioeconomic status students, and one of the ways that we can offset that is through magnet schools, which are often located in disadvantaged communities. They serve a local community, and they are open to kids that are outside of the community. So oftentimes these kids are bused into a community. And it really is helpful at combating racial prejudice, as you will have an individual who may be Asian with African American, with Hispanic and white, and all of them combined work toward a common goal, which could be a project, and they get a chance to hear of each other's strengths. And so there's a lot of expectation and a lot of hope from programs like these in here. We also find that having classrooms where there are multiple grades in there are better than single grade arrangements. So having 10th graders with 9th graders helps a lot more, as the 10th graders could be tutors, and then the tutees, the 9th graders can benefit from that interaction and then passing it along to the following year. Overall, the assessment of our education in the United States has not been the most elegant or sophisticated. In fact, the bottom line is that the education system in the United States is less challenging than other places. We do focus a lot on absorbing facts, but there's less focus on higher level reasoning and critical thinking. Recently, there's been a push for that to be added to that, but there have been many other countries that have been doing that for decades. The United States is also far less equitable in the quality of education that it provides to low-income and ethnic minorities. In fact, we find that typically the best teachers are sent to schools that are in more affluent communities. And the new teachers and those that do not get the high performance are often sent to, again, the low-income and ethnic minorities. Finland did away with the testing system in the 1980s. we in the United States test excessively, some people think. And so Finland replaced the assessments aimed at cultivating initiative with problem solving and creativity. So they'll do a project for kids who have to go to maybe do a project at an orphanage or in the community recreations park, and through there they have to master grammar, reading, writing, and reports and presentations, which aim at the higher level reasoning and critical thinking rather than just doing a report on something you read off of an article that you found at the library. Here you see the assessment and the results for the average mathematics course of 15-year-old boys in by country. And you have the Program for International Student Assessment, who's the one that conducted this in here, measured achievement in many nations around the world. And sadly, if you have not located the United States, we actually are below average. The outcomes were similar in science, and the U.S. performance in reading was at the international average. So there was nothing that actually had us above average. And this is per a study done in 2006 by Program for International Student Assessment. This leaves us with a lot of work to focus on and do a recap and do more studies on a yearly basis to try to help our children achieve higher cognitive milestones.